Chapter 19. Bombarding the Pole. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Charge the Light Brigade, Tennyson. The next morning I was awakened by the booming of heavy artillery from a great distance. Our fire ships are cutting a channel through the ice barriers from the sea to the pole, said the doctor. Would you like to see the great work? I assented, and after breakfast we got ready for the trip. As the weather was cold, we donned our Martian overcoats, fur caps, and veils. The latter screened our faces from recognition and protected them from the wind, and it is the custom for persons visiting the poles to wear them. In the company of the superintendent, we left the house and passed through the town. The surrounding country is rocky and barren, resembling the shores of Greenland. Ice and snowfields extending on every hand. We walked to the seashore where a pier was built out in the water. Here lay a small vessel similar to the one in which we had made the trip over the polar sea of Earth. It was manned with a captain and crew. We embarked and sailed up the coast several miles and entered the mouth of the great channel 20 miles wide. This is one of the sea canals cut by the fire ships directly towards the pole, said the doctor. We sailed a few miles along the shore and reached a pier. The vessel moored up and we debarked. Here was an immense quadrangular tower of red stone, 300 feet high and nearly 1,000 feet long. The superintendent escorted us up a winding staircase to the summit, a broad and level stone platform on which stood a battery of 50 cannon, bright as polished steel and of enormous dimensions. They were from 1 to 200 feet long and 5 to 10 feet caliber, and mounted on movable carriages. Huge conical shells from 10 to 20 feet long and immense globular bombs 10 feet in diameter were piled alongside the guns, with powerful machinery for loading. The guns were manned with crews in uniform. The doctor introduced us to the captain, Tsar Fulminax, a young man of bright red complexion in charge of the batteries. Excuse me. It will give me great pleasure to exhibit to your guests our mode of destroying ice, said he. Our fleet has been at work several months at the head of the channel, and large quantities of bergs and broken ice masses have been sent down the current this way. Our elevated position commanded a view of 10 or 12 miles over the channel along which the large masses of disintegrated ice were floating. In short time an immense iceberg appeared. We waited until it approached within a mile. It was full 300 feet high and 2,000 feet long. I will show you how we blow up the icebergs, said the captain, then ordered 3 of the long guns to be loaded. The gunners worked the machinery. One of the conical shells was raised and placed in the gun. Captain Fulminax leveled and fired it with a small electric battery. I expected a tremendous report, but a slight puff only, like that of a steam pipe, was heard. The shell flew across the water and plunged deep in the berg. The explosion was terrific, and tore the whole upper part to pieces. The submerged part rose heaving and tossing above the surface. This was also blown up, and another discharge destroyed the remainder. The fragments, covering several hundred acres, floated down the current. After a while, a great ice floe appeared looming on the water at the great distance up the channel. It was fully 3 miles long by a mile or more wide, consisting of irregular fragments piled up together and frozen in a solid mass. In the Arctic region of our world, these are called hummocks, and are wholly impassable to ships, and when skirting land shores are crossed with difficulty by Eskimo dogs and sleds. This floe has been disrupted from some great glacier, said the captain. I will set it on fire. 40 of the large caliber guns were loaded with the great 10-foot bombs. The gunners worked the elevating machinery, and as the huge yawning muzzles rose upward pointing to the skies, they looked almost like the weapons of the mythological Titans, ready to assault the throne of Jupiter Olympus. Soon as the floe had approached within 3 miles, all were fired simultaneously. The enormous shells rose in great curves high in the air, falling in a shower over the floe, burst open, setting it on fire in all directions. Repeated discharges were continued till the whole mass was enveloped in flames. The sight was terrible, resembling the conflagration of a great city. The firing was kept up, and in a short time the entire floe was consumed. "What are your guns loaded with?" I asked. "With water," the captain replied. The idea of loading guns with water struck me as savoring of a joke. "By means of a chemical," continued he, "the water is decomposed in its two gases with such force as can throw a shell 10 to 20 tons of weight, from 20 to 50 miles. The shells are made of a material so strong they can penetrate several hundred feet in solid ice or rock, and they are charged with a fulminate of terrible explosive power. A few gallons of water only are required for a gun. The bombs are charged with a peculiar gas condensed to a solid. This gas has a powerful affinity for oxygen. When the bomb bursts, the gas is let loose, decomposes the ice, sets the hydrogen on fire, and the mass is speedily consumed." "Why does not this gas also set fire to the water, and throw the whole ocean in a blaze?" I asked. "Sea water contains salt, as you know. When it freezes, the salt is expelled. The gas acts on the water in its frozen state only. When the flame touches the salt water, it is extinguished." We bade adieu to Captain Fulminax, descending the tower, embarked on the vessel, and continued our course up the channel. It was cut through glaciers, rocks, hill slopes, and plains, straight almost as a canal. We sailed about 50 miles up to its terminus, where it was crossed by a long line of precipices and ice barriers, several hundred feet high, which formed the slope or spur of a great mountain chain stretching to the south. An astonishing spectacle was here displayed. Directly in front of the stupendous barrier, and extending in compact line for 20 miles, lay a fleet of immense ships, each one from 1,500 to 2,000 feet long, and of corresponding dimensions. Their hulls were bright as polished copper. They had no masts, sails, nor rigging. Their decks were covered with high sloping roofs of metal supported on pillars. The decks and portholes bristled with enormous cannon, similar to those on the tower, and manned with crowds of seamen and gunners with their officers. They were bombarding the barrier with the full power of their gigantic artillery, firing point blank at the upright walls of the precipices, or at their foundations, or the surrounding reefs, or at the icebergs and glaciers, the enormous shells blowing them to pieces in all directions. Some hurled their bombs, which, falling in showers on the summits of the ice barriers or floes, burst open and set them on fire. The sight was terrible, and the uproar deafening. The explosions were like the volcanic outbursts of Vesuvius or Stromboli. Icy and rocky fragments mingled with the columns of water, and sheets of flame were hurled high in the air, thence falling almost like cataracts from the sky. The surrounding sea was converted into seething cauldron of whirling waves, foam, and fire. The downpour of rocks on the pent roofs of the ships was like the rattle of the whole brigades of musketry. Thousands of seamen in barges and floating dredges gathered up the debris, and carrying them down the channel sunk them in the deep waters of the ocean. On the other parts of the mountain slope and surrounding plain were enormous engines boring deep shafts in the solid rocks and blowing them up, while immense plowing machines ripped and tore the earthly crust in all directions, and the fragments were swiftly conveyed on great tramways many miles distant and deposited over the surface of the surrounding plains. Our vessel now sped over the channel to the fleet, reached the flagship, and we went aboard. The doctor introduced me to Admiral Tangaro Czar Arumpitos, a stout-built man of deep bronze complexion, iron-gray hair, and about 60 years of age, who received us with a hearty sailor's greeting, and showed us the appointments and armaments of his ship. She was a prodigious naval monster, built of metal, 2,000 feet long, 300 feet abeam, sailed by electromotors, was nearly 200,000 tons burden, and her speed from 60 to 80 miles per hour. 20 of our largest Atlantic steamers could lie side by side athwart her deck. Such a stupendous oceanic giant, sailing amongst the combined navies of our world, might be compared in respect to speed and power of destruction to a shark amid a shoal of herring, and the combined artillery of all the ironclads in the world could make no more impression on her adamantine hull than a child's pop gun on the hide of an elephant. A single one of her shells could blow the pyramid of Cheops sky high, and a dozen such ships lying off of London, Paris, or New York could reduce them to ashes within 24 hours. We have cut 16 great canals from 200 to 300 miles long and 10 to 20 miles wide, directly from the sea to the pole, said the admiral. We cut straight through all barriers, precipices, hills, or mountains that happen to lie in our way, besides excavating them to a sufficient depth for the passage of our largest ships and floating ice masses. We also engaged in cutting a great circumpolar sea 300 miles wide, right over the polar center, where the canals meet. We have been engaging in the work of many years. Similar operations are being conducted at the North Pole. Our average speed in cutting is from 4 to 6 miles a year. How do you prevent them from freezing up during the winter? I asked. By establishing steady currents through them. Running seawater never freezes, and we prevent the ice from accumulating along the shores by breaking it up. We were compelled to decline the admiral's polite invitation to partake of a coalition in the magnificent saloon, which was large enough to seat comfortably 1,000 guests. It would have required the removal of our veils. We bade him adieu, re-embarked, sailed down the channel, and reached the superintendent's house by nightfall. I asked the doctor what was the object in constructing these immense polar canals. As you doubtless know, he replied, our years and seasons are nearly twice as long as yours. Although our days are about equal, and in consequence of the greater inclination of our planet's axis to the plane of its orbit, it experiences greater vicissitudes of climate than your Earth. During our 6-month summer, the heats of the equatorial and southern temperate zones are greatly prolonged and intensified, and during our 6-month winter, in the polar and northern temperate zones, the cold is correspondingly prolonged and increased. We are also subject during the spring months to extensive floods and inundations from rapidly melting snow and ice. The canals are cut for the purpose of producing a more steady and uniform circulation of the waters of our oceans from the equator to the poles, the equatorial waters communicating their warmth to the polar waters, and they, in turn, cooling those of the equator. This mutual interchange also produces corresponding influences on our wind currents, thereby equalizing our climate and temperature from equator to poles. Furthermore, by removing as far as possible these vast accumulations of polar snow and ice, we greatly mollify the severity of the climate in those regions, and reclaim a greater part of the lands, rendering them inhabitable and productive. Similar canals have been cut on much larger scale over many of our continents in both hemispheres, for the purposes of establishing communications between the sea and oceans all over our planet, which renders our climate more salubrious and uniform than it would otherwise be.